I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the Russian bombardments on Ukraine that began within hours of the immediate ceasefire on energy and infrastructure allegedly agreed between Trump and Putin. Then we turn to the European reaction to the call between those two presidents and hear about the latest military updates, including in Kursk and a new incursion launched by Kyiv into Belgorod.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 19th of March, 3 years and 24 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined here at The Telegraph by our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, and staff writer at The Spectator, Ukrainian journalist Svitlana Morenets. But first, the latest military and political updates. We began yesterday's episode with our reaction to the White House and Kremlin summaries of the calls between Presidents Trump and Putin, a call which saw Moscow reject the American proposal for a 30-day ceasefire agreed with Ukraine, opting, allegedly, for a more limited pause on attacks against energy infrastructure and a small prisoner swap. We were uncertain when this so-called ceasefire on energy infrastructure, or energy and infrastructure, the wording differed in the readouts, was set to begin. But that question was answered within an hour of our broadcast when Trump posted the following on social media. My phone conversation today with President Putin of Russia was very good and a productive one. We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine. This war would never have started if I were president. Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact that thousands of soldiers are being killed, and both President Putin and President Zelensky would like to see it end. That process is now in full force and effect, and we will, hopefully, for the sake of humanity, get the job done. Trump also accepted Putin's proposal for hockey matches between Russians and Americans, a clear throwback to the US-China ping-pong diplomacy of the 1970s. So how long did this immediate ceasefire on energy and infrastructure last? About 3 hours. Russia bombed such targets in several cities, including Slovyansk in Donetsk, which left 100,000 people there temporarily without electricity. Ukraine also reported attacks in Sumy, northeast Ukraine, saying Moscow had damaged 2 hospitals there. An attack was also reported in Kyiv, and several of you who were there sent us recordings of Russian drones flying overhead and the sounds of anti-aircraft fire. A 60-year-old man was injured in the capital. Overall, Russia reportedly fired 6 missiles and 145 drones overnight. Soon afterwards, Ukraine reportedly responded with a drone attack at Kavkazskaya oil station in Russia's Krasnodar Krai, damaging a pipeline connecting storage tanks and sparking a large blaze, according to regional authorities. President Zelensky, who's currently in Finland meeting the country's Prime Minister Alexander Stubb, said joint pressure must be applied on Russia, arguing, even last night, when Putin allegedly said he had given the order to stop strikes on Ukrainian energy targets, 150 drones struck energy infrastructure and transport. Putin's words are very different from reality. We understand that later there will be a phone call between Zelensky and Trump. The EU said the Kremlin cannot be trusted. If you read the 2 readouts from the calls, said Kaja Kallas, it is clear that Russia does not really want to make any kind of concessions. Boris Pistorius, Germany's defence minister, said Putin's promises counted for nothing. Attacks on civilian infrastructure in the first night after this supposedly pivotal and great phone call have not abated, he said. Putin is playing a game here, and I'm sure that the American president won't be able to sit and watch for much longer. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson wrote, "What a surprise. Putin rejects an unconditional ceasefire. He wants to keep bombing and killing innocent Ukrainians. He wants Ukraine disarmed. He wants Ukraine neutralized. He wants to make Ukraine a vassal state of Russia. He isn't negotiating. He's laughing at us. A post by occasionally sober Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, of course, would speak to that. He said the phone calls between Presidents Putin and Trump proved a well-known idea. There is only Russia and America in the dining room. On the menu, light appetizers, Brussels sprouts, British fish and chips, and Paris rooster. The main course is a Kyiv-style cutlet. Enjoy your meal. Clearly, Mr. Medvedev doesn't know what he's talking about, not least in culinary terms, because there's no way that fish and chips from Britain would be considered a light appetizer. But anyway, I mentioned Germany a moment ago. That bill we discussed yesterday passed comfortably, meaning Merz will be able to do more in terms of government spending on rearmament. Yesterday, he told the Bundestag, Putin's war is directed not only against Ukraine, but also against Europe, against our security and our freedom. We will defend ourselves against these attacks with everything at our disposal in the coming years and decades. We learned today Berlin plans to release an extra €3 billion in military aid for Ukraine, widely seen as a breakthrough after Olaf Scholz, the outgoing chancellor, had previously obstructed the additional aid, insisting on the easing of borrowing rules as a prerequisite. Now, I'll turn to where that military aid will be going in a moment, as well as some developments on the battlefield. But just to wrap up the important diplomatic news, talks on bringing about a full ceasefire will start in Saudi Arabia on Sunday, Steve Witkoff has said. So despite the fact that Putin broke the immediate ceasefire on energy and infrastructure within hours of his call with Trump, the talk for the next phase is still ongoing. I think that speaks volumes, frankly. The New York Times reports that some members of the Trump administration believe Putin's decision to only agree to a partial ceasefire shows he is stalling, doing just enough to appear engaged while still pressing ahead on the battlefield. It doesn't name who those individuals are, but clearly there are some who are seeing through what is really going on. But the question remains, how much do facts matter in this new reality? Fundamentally, the US has approved no new aid for Ukraine. All that remains is what Biden sent in that final tranche, which is running out. There's no sign of any new sanctions on Russia, and Trump and Putin are closely coordinating their actions and saying warm things. Another distressing development for anyone concerned with the issue of the tens of thousands of kidnapped Ukrainian children is that the administration not only stopped funding that research, but reportedly has deleted all the records and testimony. A group of lawmakers has warned in a letter to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, "We have reason to believe that the data has been permanently deleted. If true, this would have devastating consequences." This is the same evidence, by the way, that was collected under the Conflict Conservatory Initiative by Yale and other researchers over the years, funded by the US budget. This database includes dossiers, names, photos, and metadata of children illegally adopted. Access, we understand, has now been blocked, and if the data is lost, those involved say it could severely impact efforts to return the children and prosecute those responsible. Frankly, how anyone could even conceive deleting such vital information and testimony is beyond me, and we will be monitoring this story closely. But lastly, let's just turn to the military situation beyond the aerial bombardments now. Yesterday, Dom spoke about the reports of a new Ukrainian incursion into the Belgorod region. Zelensky has now confirmed that as part of a broader strategy to disrupt Russian troop movements and to prevent a new assault on Ukraine's borders. According to him, Russian forces are amassing troops near the Sumy region, likely in preparation for a large-scale attack. The president also confirmed that Ukrainian forces are still actively engaged in a separate operation in Kursk, emphasizing that it will continue as long as is necessary. Despite the reports last week that a full-scale retreat from Kursk was underway, Ukrainian forces are still holding on there, though Russian forces recently advanced across the international border in Sumy Oblast as part of continued ground operations to push the Ukrainian forces from their remaining positions. Elsewhere on the battlefront, the ISW and others report Russian troops recently advanced in western Zaporizhia amid intensified Russian offensive operations in the area, likely as part of efforts to leverage Putin's deliberate stalling of the temporary ceasefire proposal to make battlefield gains. Moscow forces continued also offensive operations in the Kharkiv direction, but didn't advance, likewise near Kupiansk. The only confirmed advances are minimal and near Toretsk, north of the city of Donetsk. Of course, it's also worth saying that the fighting that's taking place around Kursk particularly is fierce, but there are no confirmed advances there for the Russians either. So those are the most significant political and military developments. Let's turn to Roland Oliphant now. Roland, it's been a while since we've shared a studio together. First off, what was your reaction to the call between Trump and Putin yesterday, and more widely, the events of the past week or so?
Hello, France. It's nice to be back. Last night, let's see, it was kind of that journalistic nagging of that thinking of, I'm missing something big. But the thing is, I'd had a chat with, I think, James Crisp, our Europe editor, who was kind of feeling he was going to be lined up to cover this. And we both decided the question is there going to be a ceasefire or not? If there is, it's going to be one of those, for a journalist, nightmarish moments that we paradoxically all live for, where you're going to have to write a front page for the history books at very, very short notice. And that was what we were kind of geared up for. Very quickly, I glanced at my phone and realised that just hadn't happened. Whatever kind of little nuances, to use a word beloved of Vladimir Putin, were in there, it was quite clear the actual kind of bang, the war is over for now, had not happened. So that's my first reaction, was that, okay, it's business as usual, really, and nothing's really changed. I read through the Kremlin readout with interest, and then the American readout, which was considerably shorter. Actually, I think you've already spoken to the interesting difference in language. Is it energy infrastructure that's off the table, or is it energy and infrastructure? And as you noted, it seems to be that seemed dead on arrival with the strike in Slavyansk and this Ukrainian drone strike on the oil depot refinery, or whatever it is, down in Krasnodar. So, yeah, I mean, I think everyone can see it for what it is. I think it's clear that if Putin wanted to stop things and order a ceasefire, it would be very, very simple to do so. What you've got is kind of gambits that will keep Trump at the table, dangling stuff and drag out the process, but which are not going to stop things on the ground at all. And I think I'd be very surprised if you spoke to anybody in Ukraine, either civilians back in Kiev or soldiers down the front, who would say they're seeing anything practical on a change at that level. What else did I say? Yeah, I think, I'm sure people have commented on this before, but there's like this weird kind of double standard between how Trump deals with the Russians and how he deals with the Ukrainians. When Volodymyr Zelensky tried to raise all these points about things along the lines of, look, there's no point in having a ceasefire until we know it's not going to be broken, and there's all these points to think about, and it's quite complex. Trump was like, no, shut up. You haven't got the cards. Sign the dotted line. We're going to have a ceasefire. Zelensky's forced to say, all right, okay, fine, we'll have a ceasefire, whatever you say, and then we'll think about the other stuff. Vladimir Putin, I've got the Kremlin readout here. I don't think you need the exact words, but things like the president pointed out a string of significant issues concerning guaranteeing or ensuring the ceasefire along the entire, of course, that additional demand, fairly unreasonable really, that Ukraine doesn't get to rearm. Of course, the Russians will rearm. Who's going to police this? All these little points. You feel that if the Ukrainians are saying that, the Americans have no patience with it whatsoever. So definitely a different kind of approach. But then again, I think the broad context is interesting too, which is that both sides are talking about a general thaw in American-Russian relations. And I think really that's what the Trump administration is after here. I almost feel that the Ukraine war isn't really the issue for the Trump administration. They want it out of the way. What they're after, and you can see it, this hockey game, this talk about a meeting between Elon Musk and Kirill Dmitriev, interesting character, head of the Central Investment Fund. It's about a general thaw between Moscow and Washington. That seems to be the vision in America. So that's my reaction.
You talk about that thaw there, Roland. I just want to explore that a little bit more deeply, if I may. You think that thaw is designed to drive a wedge between the Russians and the Chinese?
Oh, I think that's part of it. I mean, that's part of the thinking, and you can see that going back a while in kind of things that people close to the administration have written and have thought about. And you see all this talk about a reverse Nixon. There's lots of this reference to Nixon's famous trip to China. I'm sure you've mentioned this many times, but of course, the point was then China and the Soviet Union were basically on the brink of war. They'd already fought a border skirmish, for pity's sake. In fact, if I remember my kind of not very good COD A-level history properly, I'm pretty sure at some point the Soviets had gone to Nixon's government and said, we've had enough of these annoying Maoists, we're going to go for it, and we're probably going to nuke them. So just in case you see us launching some ICBMs, it's not for you. And I believe, please, maybe I shouldn't be putting this out there because I haven't double-checked it. If I remember my Cold War history, there is some very frantic bit of diplomacy that the White House did to kind of avert a really nasty blow-up between the Soviet Union and Chinese at that point. So the point is, that's the context, right? The context here is the complete opposite. You heard... Did you still watch Donald Trump on Fox News? Who's the interviewer? She's quite good, quite interrupting and holding him to quite decent, I thought, actually. But anyway, one of the things he said when she put that point to him, you're trying to split them apart, he talked about, look, it's not a natural alliance, there are historic animosities. He's not wrong about that. But there's the kind of current context and there's a broader historical context. But yes, I do think that's part of the vision. He also talked very openly about business, right? So the point is, Russia is the largest country on the planet in terms of landmass. It obviously has a lot of rare earths and other minerals. Why should America lock itself out of that market? As far as he's concerned, clearly he sees a lot of upsides to getting back to business as usual with Moscow, and that seems to be driving through all of this.
Well, thanks very much, Roland. I know many people will be saying, to your point, it's extremely naive to think that wedge can be driven between the two, given the nature of the relationship between...
Yeah, no, but he's not. But look, Trump is not entirely wrong here. All right, there are underlying that Chinese-Russian relationship. There are tensions. Right, he's not entirely wrong to point those out, but the context of today is... But
playing devil's advocate slightly, I agree, but the Chinese think long term, and they'll be thinking, well, Trump, for all of his perhaps alliances with Russia now or whatever, it's in a long-term interest. America is still the ally, and Russia is also going to be more likely an enemy of the United States, and therefore we don't need to worry about this particularly because we know that we can think in the longer term, and whatever is going on at the moment, it won't have a massive impact on them, surely.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and get into... I have enough trouble getting to Vladimir Putin's head. I'm not going to try and get into Xi Jinping's head. I think, look, the fundamental thing driving this Russian-Chinese alliance is a shared global vision, right? And the global vision is that the world has for too long been under the American heel or boot in the unipolar world. We're going to have a multipolar world now. America's going to be put back in its box, and we're going to divide the world in a different way. They completely share that vision. Now, I'll play devil's advocate, and this is teenage boy with, a risk board level of geopolitics, all right? So it's pretty crude, but think about it this way. If that's what's holding the Russians and the Chinese together, if Donald Trump's idea is to retreat from global domination, withdraw the American empire back to the Western Hemisphere, and cut a deal dividing up the world with those two, then the entire reason for the Chinese-Russian relationship has been extinguished and America can make an ally of Russia. There you go. That's my 4D chess move.
Well, no doubt there are people who are thinking in those terms at the moment in the White House and other places, but I think we will have to see whether we get anywhere near to that. One final question to you, if I may, Roland. Of course, you are one of the hosts on Battle Lines, our sister podcast, which looks at other global affairs at the moment. We've obviously strayed somewhat into those in the last conversation that we've had. But are there any other news stories, just briefly, that you've been looking into, which you think is relevant to this or would be of interest to listeners right now?
Everything we do on Battle Lines is of interest to Ukraine, the latest readers, because it's first-class journalism about all the conflicts around the world, and you really want to tune in. Yes, we've looked at a few things. On something, I'll start off with something a little bit further out there. Our last episode on Monday was about South Sudan, also about Yemen, and the reason for that is that there are these long-running conflicts that get overlooked to a degree, but there's also a huge, there's a regional kind of Game of Thrones, great game going on in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea and the Gulf kind of region. And there is also concurrent with all of this stuff that we talk about in Ukraine, the latest all the time, is another enormous kind of confrontation, which is the one between Iran, Israel, and America. Yemen is now part of that. People are suffering there as a result of it. We spoke to a very interesting Yemeni bloke about that. We have a great interview also with an MSF doctor who's in South Sudan who can talk about really, really interesting stuff about the humanitarian situation there. Stuff that's more directly related to Ukraine. Our last episode on Monday, we looked at two things. We had a really interesting chat with a guy called Tom Wright. Now, Tom Wright is at, I hope I get this right, I think it's the Brookings Institution, one of the American think tanks. But he was, for 3 years until Biden stepped down, he was running the White House Security Council. He was in charge of strategic planning. So he was working for Jake Sullivan. So we had a really interesting conversation about how the Biden White House approached all these problems that the Trump White House is approaching. We talked a lot about Ukraine, actually. And we talked about the charge that Jake Sullivan was too cautious on Ukraine and Russia. And he had interesting things to say about that. We talked about what the Biden vision, the Biden White House's vision was for this year and for this approach to peace talks, because they too were anticipating peace talks in 2025. They just had a different kind of approach to it. And we talked about the Pacific and this containing of China and how the Biden administration had really tried to put in a network of alliances there to contain China and the question marks about whether that's going to continue. The other thing we talked about was our senior foreign correspondent, Memphis Barker, recently went out to Alberta in Western Canada to speak to Canadian separatists. Now, this caused a stir with our Canadian listeners. We've got turns out about 25% of our listeners are Canadian. A lot of them were not very pleased with it. To be fair, we did get people writing in saying you're talking to a minority. Yes, it was a minority. The reason we spoke to these people is because in places of this kind of what do you call it? International trouble spots. I don't know. Like Ukraine is a great example. Small minority separatist movements can suddenly end up playing a significant role as things unravel and so on. So Memphis went out, he spoke to these. It's a very small minority. Let's be clear, like 90% of Canadians in the latest polling, very clear, are not interested at all in joining the United States. But there's about 10% of people, 1 in 10, who are prepared to, he found a guy who was prepared to say the oath of allegiance and renounce his Canadian loyalty. It's treason, right? But nonetheless, these people are there, and there's a political context that creates potentially, if things get really, really bad, a kind of, I'm going to say fifth column, but you can see what I'm getting at, right? There is something for the Americans if Donald Trump really wants to get aggressive to work with that. It's a very interesting, very delicate situation. As I said, we had a lot of feedback on that. In response to that feedback, we have had some of our listeners, we've got voice notes from them and their response to that, Canadians. This episode on Friday is all about Canada. We've got Mark McKinnon, who is one of the most well-known Canadian foreign correspondents, trying to explain Canada to foreigners rather than explaining the world to Canada, looking at all of this. And again, Mark is a guy who, like me, has covered Ukraine since 2014, was there in Slavyansk when Igor Girkin took over, all of that stuff. And he's got really interesting things to say about the parallels there and the parallels between Donald Trump's rhetoric about how Canada isn't even a real country, it only works as a state, it's an artificial border, and how that really weirdly mirrors stuff that Vladimir Putin was saying for years about Ukraine. So yes, please tune in and listen.
Well, thanks very much, Roland. And as I say, we'll have links in the show notes to those episodes of Battle Lines. Let's return to Ukraine specifically, though, and welcoming back Svitlana Morenets of The Spectator. Svitlana, thank you for your time today. Can I start, first of all, just by asking you, what was the Ukrainian reaction to the outcomes of Putin and Trump's calls yesterday? Was it enthusiasm or was it despair?
Thank you for having me back, Francis. To be honest, I was relieved when I heard the news and Trump didn't sell out Ukraine, because for a moment it felt like that was going to happen. And if you followed the Ukrainian social media yesterday, you could really see how the tension was piling up during Trump and Putin call. And some people were suggesting that it is better to go to the bomb shelter where there is no internet, so you can avoid the bad news at least for some time. I would say why Ukrainians expected the worst, because right before the call, Trump said that he's going to discuss dividing up assets in Ukraine with Putin. And it looked like it was America and Russia talking about how they divide Ukraine, while Kyiv was sidelined in the talks. So far as we know, it didn't happen. As for the partial ceasefire, I remember I wrote to my friends in Kyiv, and it was already late evening, and I was like, does it mean that Russia won't strike Kyiv anymore, at least? I don't know, at least some civilian infrastructure. And like in 5 minutes, they started writing me that Russia was bombing Kyiv. And then they bombed Sumy, and it seemed that the ceasefire didn't last very long. I think that Ukraine learned from the previous ceasefires that we had with Russia over 20 since 2014. And now Zelensky said that Ukraine is preparing a list of energy infrastructure facilities that Russia can't strike to monitor if they really comply with the ceasefire. And if Russia strikes them, then Ukraine is going to respond and strike Russia back.
Thanks, Svitlana. And what has the impact been of these calls between Trump and Putin on President Zelensky's popularity? Because it seems that almost the longer this goes on, this kind of diplomacy, if we can call it that, the more that President Zelensky becomes a revered figure in Ukraine. Is that accurate?
Yes, so the more Trump attacks Zelensky, the higher his popularity will be, because Ukrainians see Zelensky more like an institution that represents Ukraine and defends their right for the just peace. And as long as Zelensky is defending that right, Ukrainians are going to support him. And also the majority of Ukrainians are against elections during the war. So it's understandable why they are running up behind Zelensky. Also, I would say that soldiers who are on the front line, when they see that Zelensky is defending a Ukrainian position on the negotiation table, they feel more calm and safe that their backs, that Zelensky is not going to stop there in their backs, but they are risking their lives on the front line. That's why Zelensky is supported too. So while he is doing everything right, he will remain popular in Ukraine.
Thank you. Now, we've, of course, spoken many times about former Ukrainian President Poroshenko, and for a long time, his view has been stated that he supports Zelensky's right to continue in office, that under martial law, it's not unconstitutional for him to remain there. But it seems that he's broken cover in the last 48 hours, and he's launched a scathing attack on Zelensky, defending Trump and calling for a major shift in Ukraine's military strategy. So in this interview, he accused Zelensky's team of moving the country to a dictatorship, with the rule of law being brutally violated. He called Trump the only person who can stop the war, and I can absolutely guarantee that he's not pro-Russian, Poroshenko said. And then he said that Ukraine needs to halt all offensive operations against Russian forces and shift to defense. He said we should not forget the words offensive operation. Stop doing that. Stop killing people. So how do you explain this shift, Svitlana? Has somebody in the White House given him some soft words and said perhaps that you're the man for the job if Zelensky goes, do you think?
Partially, I would start that Zelensky imposed sanctions against Poroshenko in several weeks ago, and Poroshenko is accused of serious crimes like high treason and financial terrorism because he was purchasing coal for the Ukrainian thermal power plants from Russian-occupied Donetsk and Luhansk region back in 2014-2015. So he was actually financing, maybe, I don't know, willingly, not willingly, the prosecution found out, but he was financing the terrorists in the east of Ukraine. But I would add that it's also part of the political persecution from Zelensky. I guess you saw the news from Politico that Trump's team has been negotiating with the Ukrainian opposition, thinking if Ukraine can hold the early elections, and maybe they can move Zelensky from the landscape in Ukraine. But I think it is such a mistake from the Trump's team, the same as Putin did in 2022, when he thought that Ukrainians would meet his army with flowers and not with the resistance. distance. Trump's team completely doesn't understand what is happening in Ukraine, who is popular in Ukraine. And as for Poroshenko, he's doing completely the opposite. He's thinking that Ukrainians will rally to support him, but Ukrainians actually are writing him hate comments under that interview because he's undermining Ukraine's government in such a vulnerable moment.
It does seem that there has been some kind of drive behind closed doors to get the opposition riled up, doesn't it, by the Trump team to try and provoke there to be some sort of calls for Zelensky to go. Clearly, Trump sees Zelensky as part of the problem for him in Ukraine and is effectively trying to dismantle that approach. It's quite extraordinary.
Yes, he is at the same level as Putin, trying to intervene into Ukrainian landscape and to define who should rule Ukraine and who shouldn't rule Ukraine. And the big problem for him that most of the opposition in Ukraine, if not all, their approval ratings are very, very low comparing to Zelensky's ones. I mean, Poroshenko, people who would vote for Poroshenko, according to a recent poll, there was like only 5%. For Yulia Tymoshenko, there was like 2%. I understand why Trump's team is not negotiating with Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former army chief, because he is as hawkish on Russia, maybe even more than Zelensky. And he recently stated that America is destroying the world order and Europe and Ukraine should unite and stand against Russia.
Very strong words from him, which we reported at the time. And I think, yeah, you can imagine some people saying, well, that's him, not somebody we can do business with then in the White House. Yeah. There was one other story, Svitlana, if I may, that I wanted to ask you about. And that is one you've been looking into, Russia recruiting Ukrainian teenagers. Can you talk a little bit about this story and give context? I don't think we've reported on this yet.
So as you know, the Russian Telegram app is very popular in Ukraine. More than 80% of Ukrainians use it. And it became very popular at the beginning of war because you could read the breaking news and know where you should run and to know what is happening. But it is also used by Russian special secret services to recruit young Ukrainians to blow up enlistment offices or target the Ukrainian soldiers. And during the recent months, we had cases when teenagers aged 15, 17, especially the case last week when two boys made a self-explosive bomb and they were carrying it into the railway station in Ivano-Frankivsk on the west of Ukraine. And Russians detonated it from the distance, and one of the boys unfortunately died and the other is in the hospital. So how they are recruiting them? They are offering them cash, and a lot of cash. I would say $100 for exposing home addresses and photos of enlistment officers, $2,000 for setting their vehicles on fire, and $5,000 for burning down a draft office. So it's quite a big operation, and Ukrainian security service has tried to counterattack it and expose those collaborators before they actually go with the bomb and blow up something. But unfortunately, they can't trace them all, and in the recent months, lots of Ukrainian military veterans, because usually military veterans, they become enlistment officers. So they were or hurt in the explosions, or they were shot, or they were stabbed. So it's a big problem for Ukraine. And our intelligence chief, Kirill Bodanov, he was saying 1 year ago that Russia is using Telegram against Ukraine as just another kind of weapon, and Ukraine should ban this app. But so far, there have been no movement in that direction, and I don't see any politicians talking about that. But this problem is becoming more and more acute in Ukraine.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And just to give listeners a sense of what you were saying there, Telegram is almost the default source of news, isn't it, for many in Ukraine? And I remember being in Kharkiv, which is that everybody is on Telegram because it's where you go to get the updates on where the missiles are coming from, where the drones are being spotted. And this is information by some in the government, but also just from ordinary people. And it's a sort of hive mind of what's going on at any given moment. And so you can have a Telegram channel which is focused on one particular region, one particular city, as well as relating to whole issues in Ukraine. And so it's very, very specific. A bit like, I suppose, for people who aren't on Telegram, it's a bit like Facebook communities, but as an instant messenger.
But on Telegram, you can create like chats and like secret chats that you have to request the access, and if administrator can approve you or not approve. So they are looking for usually for a man who are young, unemployed. They are easily pursued into such activities who need some quick money, because as you know, because of the war, a lot of Ukrainians live in poverty right now, and it's also some Ukrainians who oppose the conscription in Ukraine. There, of course, there is a percentage that doesn't want to be mobilized in the army. So that's why they target the enlistment officers.
Well, Svitlana, thank you very much. As ever, it's always a pleasure hearing your reflections on the issues of the day relating to Ukraine. Let's go to our final thoughts now. Roland.
I think we should be a bit wary of being too snide about the Trump team's efforts here. One of the things that the Russians were signalling all the way into this, in which they made clear they wanted in their readout, was if you want us to sign up to a 30-day ceasefire, you've got to stop supplying Ukraine with weapons. The Americans clearly did not bow to that on the call yesterday, which is why the talks are still going. So they didn't just give away the farm, despite what a lot of people are saying. So bear that in mind. The other thing is, I've just seen on, let me see, where is this? News UA citing European Pravda, citing the I paper, saying that British special forces are being prepared to be sent to Ukraine as part of the UK's peacekeeping mission. Now, for those of you who don't work in the news, we have a kind of joke in the British media about an SAS on standby story. Now, an SAS on standby story is a story that you can write anytime you like, because the SAS are always on standby. If you write the SAS on standby, no one's going to deny it. It's true. It's their job. So, which is my way of saying, if you see a story like that, treat it with a little grain of salt, because it might not signify that anything's actually happened at all out of the ordinary. That said, of course, that debate about where this potential European, British and French-led stabilization force to Ukraine is going to come from, that's a live debate. That's my amusing way of getting into that point.
Well, thanks very much, Roland. Svitlana Morenets, where would you like to leave our listeners?
I want to comment on the American aid. I think there is a high possibility that Trump will satisfy Putin's demand that there will be no US aid to Ukraine. Just as soon as Biden's aid package runs out, Trump will simply not approve new packages for Ukraine, and then Ukraine will be cut off from US aid. Also, I think as a final thought to add, we should think about what is Putin's final goal from all of this. And I think what differs him from Trump is Trump needs ceasefire as soon as possible, and Trump sees these talks just a path for his victory, because his goals have not changed in Ukraine. And I just hope that Donald Trump will use pressure on Russia, like sanctions and any other ways, to force Putin to make some concessions, because he has to accept that there is no way that Ukraine will completely fall under Russians' rule. He lost the chance in 2022, and it's not going to happen never again.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really does help others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every single message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by executive producers Louisa Wells and David Knowles.